Hello, I'm Braggy, and today it is a story day. Oh yes, I love a good story day on the channel. As you may not know, we are a storytelling channel called Northworthy Sagas and Stories, and I am your host for today. And today's story, it's a brilliant little story about an old miser who comes from Scotland, from a place near Falkirk. Oh yes, and has this theme of apple pies, and I must say, I do love a good apple pie. So what are you going to get out of this story? Well, you're going to be entertained, and hopefully I'll be funny, and you'll have 10 minutes of going back to 1,000 years ago or more. So, a long time ago, in the land of Scotland, the home of those Scottish brave Hiberno Norse Vikings, and later on the Scots, of course, there lived a man. He was an old man, been around for quite a few seasons. You know, he's had his family's all grown up and left his long house and got on their journeys, and his daughters got married and his sons went adventuring. But this man, he was well known in the area for being a bit of a miser. And you may be asking yourself, well, what, Braggy, is exactly a miser? Well, a miser is somebody that is very, you could say, tight or very clever with the money. They don't like to spend money, you know, when they don't have it. They're not a spendthrift. They won't go out and willy-nilly go and spend money and buy things they don't need. So they're always saving, and they'll always buy things on the cheap. So a miser is somebody who is just fundamentally tight with the money. And this man was very, very tight with his money, you know. He didn't like to lose anything, you know. If he bought some logs, he wanted all the logs. He wouldn't leave them outside to get wet. Oh no, to him that was a waste of money. Because why pay for logs that are dry when they get wet afterwards? You know, if he bought a good 9-foot spear, he would make sure it's 9 foot, you know, and check for the quality. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you go and buy a good spear, always make sure your spear is a quality make. Oh yes. And so, our man, who has again no name in this story, from Scotland, was a bit of a person who was tight with his money. He had a nice long house, and he had quite a few servants. He could afford to have servants, you know. He was married, had a wife still, and they was both probably in the 40s or 50s. In those times was very old, and he was highly respected, and he was a wise man as well. Many people came to him and they had a problem, you know. Not long back his neighbour came because he had some sheep gone missing, and he said, well, you must search all your valleys and all your mountains until you look. And you know, this sheep farmer did this, and he found this sheep. So he listened to this old wise man. And every weekend, every Saturday or Sunday, he'll have a little feast. He was quite lucky. He had some good land, and he had some good fields of wheat and barley, and he also had a large orchard. And he was very well known for apples and pears. For he, you know, he had a lot of sunshine where he lived, and they managed to grow in the climate of Scotland. But the apples in those times were much smaller than today's apples. Not like, you know, a good old granny apple. Oh no, much smaller, but just as nice. And so what he loved was apple pies. So every Sunday or Saturday at the weekend, when his wife, his wife in Anglo-Saxon, got around to it, she would go and make some nice apple pies. And of course they lived in a longhouse, but it was not like an Anglo-Saxon or a Viking longhouse, because it had a stone foundation and wall, and on top of the wall they built the beams and the rafters for the roof, and the roof was covered in thousands of wooden shingles. And that alone is a skill, to make shingles. And a shingle is just basically, folks, a wooden tile. Not like today's tiles when they're ceramic and pottery and clay. Oh no, in the old days they would use thatch roofs of good reeds, or they would use wooden shingles. And so he had this tradition of having apple pies at the weekend. He loved them. And why not? He works hard in the week, tending his land, counting his money and making profit every week, selling his livestock at a market in Falkirk. Oh yes, a wonderful and beautiful place. Oh yes, I've been once and I want to go again. And when his wife had made the pies, for outside she had an old clay oven, and a clay oven was basically had a clay floor, and it was a dome of clay, and inside the clay would be all these sticks. Probably willow was the best choice, although you can use hazel, and both would have been available in the lowlands and highlands of Scotland in certain places. And so this old clay oven his wife would use to bake the apple pies, and they would make the flour from the wheat and the barley, and have a cornstone and mix up and make the flour. Oh yes, and collect the apples, and that's basically what you need, and some fat, you know. And they always got a fat from the animals, and in fat from cooking, because they saved everything in the old times. They would not throw something away which would later be proven to be useful. And so she had some very nice lard, some fat, and she put that in, and she had a shelf on the outside of her longhouse. In the old days of Scotland they called it a croft, which is just another word for longhouse in my mind. But if you know more, let me know. And she had a window, a slatted window with shutters, and it had a shelf where she could put the apple pies. But something started to happen. Every time she made an apple pie, and she would make 3 or 4 of them, one of them would disappear, would go. Somebody's been stealing and taking the pies. Oh yes. Now this started to upset this old Scottish man, because it all costs money. Start again, it all costs money. You know, flour and the time to make the wheat. And he could not live with the fact that he was being robbed of his favourite apple pies. It's one thing to steal your silver, but it's another thing to steal your apple pies. And I love an apple pie myself. Oh yes, even better with rhubarb. And so weeks and weeks went past, and every weekend one of the apple pies was stolen. At first he thought, well, I tell you what, I'm gonna hang on the outside of my homestead and watch for the culprit. And he did this a few times, but he could never find the culprit. The culprit never came to the window and took a pie, even though the pie disappeared. So he thought to himself, well, whoever's stealing and taking my pies is very clever. And again, he went to the local church and he spoke to the old priest, and they gave him some advice and said, oh, you must wait in your longhouse and watch the pies, and then you will catch the pie thief. Again, he did this, but he did not catch the thief of the pie. And again, more weeks went past, more apple pies were stolen, and it was always an apple pie. That's what he loved. I'm sure you agree, if you work hard all week, so I can't speak some days and I got a cold. If you work hard all week, on your land, and tending to all your tasks and deeds you got to do, then at the end of the week you deserve a pint of beer and an apple pie for your dessert pudding. And so he had no idea what to do. And so one day I was outside in his courtyard, and he always had a magpie that could come down and peck around. And one day he was watching this magpie, and this magpie landed before him, and something very unusual happened. In fact, some people say that it was actually supernatural, for the magpie spoke a few words. And the magpie said this: get 'em drunk, and kept on repeating that phrase, get 'em drunk, get 'em drunk. And the old man, he thought about this. Why, that's a very good idea, because he thought that it was one of his servants, and he had quite a few that was stealing the apple pie. And so one night at the weekend before the day, often it was a Saturday, the pie was stolen, but some days his wife cooked on a Sunday and the pies were stolen then. So one night on a Saturday, the day of the Norns in the old Viking tongue, or Saturn's Day to the Romans of course, he got a lot of ale in and said, today all my servants, and he paid them well, he said, today we're going to celebrate, for I have been here for 30 years. Of course he made that up. But he got a massive bowl of beer, he got some cider and wine, some nice food, venison and beef and lamb, and stews and cheese and beans and all the wonderful food, especially cheese. And so the idea was to get all of his servants, his staff, drunk. And as he did this, he kept on plying them with ale in the drinking horns, and they would drink until the last servant was drunk. And then he stood up and he said, which one of you has been stealing my apple pies? And he went round individually and shook his fist until he got a reply. And until the last man he came to, he boasted, oh, it was me, I stole your apple pies, because he was so drunk and merry he could not hold his tongue. Oh yes. And that is the end of the story, and how this man found out who was the thief of his apple pies. Oh yes, I'm sure you agree. If somebody was coming to your house and stealing your apple pies, you would want to find out too. Oh yes. If you've enjoyed this story from Scotland, home of the brave, and those Scottish brave men and women, and share this story for us. Go out and share it amongst your friends and your family and anybody who you know that may love a story. And the second most important thing to do is to like the video. By doing those two things, YouTube and the algorithm will understand and get the message that this channel is the decent channel. And I often say it to my friends and people that we are probably one of the most underrated channels on YouTube, because we have produced a lot of content and a lot of decent quality content, and things from now on are only going to get better. And I will finish this with the wise words of Egil Thorson: onwards and upwards.